at mga targets talaga, hindi talaga nakita na kakailanganin yung charter change. So I just like to make that.
Huwag na po tayong Filipino first. No one study I have seen thus far has demonstrated quite creditably that ownership by Filipinos work. I challenge anyone here around the table, the social scientists. Economic managers cannot in fact lower or eradicate the 21% of their privileges na sinabi mo, no? Na mga poor. Aba, mag-hire tayo po ng international group of economic managers. We pay them depending on the percentage of increment that they are going to contribute to GDP. I know this is an iconoclastic viewpoint, but for God's sake, we have to be iconoclast now. You know, we are the fifth most mineralized countries in the world. We have millions of professionals. We should be embarrassed that we have 21% who are poor. Tama ba, Dr. Villegas? Tama, di ba? Asked me to help them design their strategy for the Air Force, for the Philippine Marines, etc. Sabi ko, saan ba kayo nakatukod yung strategy nyo? Meron bang National Defense Plan? O kung ang isip nyo lang yan? Saan magagaling yung National Defense Plan, Senator Paul? Hindi. Senator Paul, you mentioned something about banning certain countries from ownership. And are you referring to China?
In the Public Service Act, any country that the President or the National Security Council views as a threat to us is actually eliminated from or banned from owning certain critical infrastructure, telecommunications, for example, I believe airports, etc. And also, countries that don't reciprocate or allow us also the same type of ownership in their country would not be allowed. Those are some of the safeguards we put as a compromise to those who are a little bit wary about this Public Service Act being open.
Yeah, with all due respect, I agree with the reciprocity, but the first one I don't. Because if you have a strict regulatory framework, then it can be a to whom it may concern. So I think we should not ban XYZ.
Salamat po sa usapin na yan. Sa mga tagapangulo po, dadating naman po ang ating Ginoong Pangulo. Babanggitin ko na rin po siya. Maraming salamat sa aming Ginoong Pangulo, Senator Mig Subiri, sapagkat siya po ang namuno sa hakbangin na ito na maamendahan ang economic provision sa saligang batas. Ako po ay sumasaludo sa aming Ginoong Pangulo. Ako din po ay nagbibigay pugay kay Sir Gary Teves, ang akin pong tumatayong economic advisor. At ako po ay naliligayahan at kasama po natin siya ngayon bilang isang ating pong resource speaker. At ganun din po ang aking kaibigan na si Orion. Sir, maraming salamat po at nandito po kayo. Noon pa man, batid naman po ninyo ang aking damdamin tungkol sa pag-amyenda ng ating saligang batas. Simula nang ako ay mahalal bilang senador at maitalagang tagapangulo ng committee ito, ay isinulong na po ng inyong lingkod ang mga mungkahing susog, partikular sa mga pang-ekonomiyang probisyon na sa aking paniniwala ay nagiging hadlang sa ating pag-arangkada tungo sa tunay na pag-unlad. Subukan po nating lagyan ng konteksto. Ang ilan sa mga economic provisions sa 1987 Constitution na hinahangad nating amendahan ay minana pa po natin sa mga naunang saligang batas. Marami-rami ng dekada ang nakalipas. Ito po ang panahong sariwa pa sa kaisipan at damdamin ng mga bumalangkas ng konstitusyon ang napakahabang mga taon ng pananakop ng mga dayuhan sa ating bayan. Kaya't pinalakas ang Filipino First. Ito ang prinsipyong isinasaisip at isinapuso ng mga delegado. Fast forward po tayo sa kasalukuyan. Ano po ba ang kinaharap ng Pilipinas bilang isang bansa sa kontemporaryong panahon? Meron pong isang termino, globalisasyon. By definition, globalization is the word used to describe the growing interdependence of the world's economies, cultures, and populations brought about by cross-border trade in goods and services, technology, and flows of investment, people, and information. Sa isang kalungkutan, ang mahigpit na probisyon po sa ating saligang batas ay hindi na angkop sa pandaigdigang kalakaran sa ekonomiya. Nabanggit na rin po natin ito noon. Sa kasalukuyan, ang ating bansa ay pangatlo sa 83 na ekonomiya. Sa pinakamahigpit sa mga regulasyon base sa Foreign Direct Investment Regulatory Restrictiveness Index ng Organization for Economic Cooperation Development. base sa Foreign Direct Investment Attractiveness Scorecard noong 2020, ang Pilipinas ay nasa dulo, 13th sa 14th na ekonomiya sa Asia Pacific. Pang 13 po tayo sa 14 na ekonomiya sa Asia Pacific. Batid naman po nating sinubukan na itong gamutin sa pamamagitan ng pagpasa ng Public Services Act. Subalit nga po, nung ating binigyan diin nung nakaraan at binanggit din ng ating Senate President Juan Miguel Zubiri, ang nakabinbing pang-question po nito sa Korte Suprema ay nagbibigay pa rin ng alinlangan sa mga dayuhang mamumuhunan. Ito po ang dahilan kung kaya't hindi pa tayo makaarangkada sa implementasyon ng batas. Sa paghahain po ng resolusyon bilang 6 ng ating mga iginagalang na mga senador, Senate President Zubiri, Senadora Ligarda at Senador Angara, natutuwa po ako na mabibigyan ng pagkakataon ang diskusyon sa pagpapaluwag ng ating konstitusyon tungkol sa mga restriksyon sa mga pampublikong kagamitan, institusyong pang-edukasyon at industriya ng advertising. Ako po ay nagpapasalamat sa tagapangulo ng Senado sa kanyang malawat at pangunawa sa prinsipyong aking tinitindigan, gayon din sa aking mga kasamahan dito sa Senado. Muli po, ako po ay nagpupugay sa ating Pangulo ngayon ng subcommittee na ito, Senator Sani Angara, sapagkat ito pong hakbang na ito ay tunay na aking pong pinaniniwalaan na makatutulong sa pag-unlad ng ating bansa at makawala po sa tanikala ng pangungutang sapagkat sa usapin po ng lohika, kapag ka may investment, ibig sabihin may puhunan. Kapag ka may puhunan, ay merong iikot na pera. At pag umikot ang pera, magkakaroon po ng trabaho, magkakaroon ng tamang sweldo, at magkakaroon po ng ibig sabihin ng pagtakbo at pag-ikot ng ekonomiya. Kaya muli po, maraming salamat at mabuhay po.
Maraming salamat, Chairperson Senator Robin Padilla, ang chair ng ating Committee on Constitutional Amendments. Thank you for the kind words.
Senator Robin Hood Padilla is recognized.
Maraming salamat po, Ginoong Pangulo, at sa ating pong pinunong mayorya. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah rabbil alamin. Bismillahi wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Ginoong tagapangulo, sa mga kagalang-galang na miyembro ng lupon na ito, tumitindig po ako sa pulpitong ito sa bisa ng kolektibo at personal na pribilehyo na iginawad sa inyong abang lingkod ng mamamayang Pilipino. Napaka-init po, masalimuot at mapanghati. Ganito po ang aking paglalarawan sa mga pangyayaring bumalot at nangingibabaw sa mga ulo ng mga balita sa ating bayan nitong mga nakalipas na linggo at hanggang ngayon pong kasalukuyan. Mabuti na lamang po ay mayroong magandang balita na nangyayari dito po sa Senado. Hindi po mapagkakaila na pati po tayo dito, mahal na Ginoong Pangulo, ay may mga forces na gusto rin tayong guluhin. Katunayan, ang inyo pong lingkod ay pinipilit ng mga ibang forces na ito. Alam niyo po, Ginoong Pangulo, wala pong pinakamagandang nangyari sa pagiging senador ko kung hindi yung panahon na ang akin pong Ginoong Pangulo, ang Senate President at ang Senate Tempor at ang ginagalang kong Senador Sani Angara at Senadora Laurel Ligarda ay nag-file na itong bill na atin pong tinidinig, isang resolusyon, isang panukala na nagbibigay buhay sa akin pong mga adhikain. Alam niyo po, Ginoong Pangulo, yun po ang pinakamagandang desisyon na nakita ko at pinakatamang desisyon na pamunuan po ito ng ating abogado at ekonomista na si Senator Sani Angara. Sapagkat ito po ay, ang pinag-uusapan po dito ay sanga-sanga. Sanga-sanga na po. Katunayan sa ginanap pong pagdinig kanina, ay napag-usapan po yung mga tensyon at mga diskusyon na nakaakibat ng panukala na ito. Itong resolusyon na ito, itong hakbangin na ito. Sapagkat hindi po may pagkakaila at kanina ilang beses din na sinabi na yung nasa Section 1, Artikulo 17 ng ating saligang batas na nagsasaad na
ang anumang susog o pagbabago sa konstitusyon, ito ay maaaring ipanukala ng Kongreso sa pamamagitan ng 3/4 na boto ng lahat ng mga kagawad nito. Sa wikang Ingles, any amendment to or revision of this Constitution may be proposed by Congress upon a vote of 3/4 of all its members. Marami na pong mga eksperto, lupo ng mga abogado, mambabatas, mga maestrado at legal luminaries na nagbigay ng kani-kanilang mga interpretasyon sa probisyong ito. Halimbawa po, ayon kina dating Justice Vicente V. Mendoza at iba pang mga bihasa sa konstitusyon, ang dalawang houses ay dapat magtagpo at magdebate ng sabayan jointly. Pero boboto ng hiwalay, separately. Malinaw po yan na ipinagdiinan ni Justice Vicente V. Mendoza. Gama din po natin ang silakbo ng damdamin ni Justice Mendoza sa ating pagdinig sa Committee on Constitutional Amendments and Revision of Codes sa kanyang naratibo tungkol sa talastasan sa pagitan ni na Commissioner Jose Suarez at Commissioner Florence Regalado sa komposisyon ng Section 1 at 2 ng Artikulo 17. Base po sa opisyal na record, sa paglilinaw ni Commissioner Regalado, sakaling bicameral legislative body ang mamutawi, sinabi po mismo ni Commissioner Suarez na ilalagay sa konstitusyon ang pariralang in joint session assembled. Bagamat ito po ay tila nakaligtaan. Hindi naman po tahimik ang mga tala sa intensyong ito. Ginoong Pangulo, atin pong binibigyan diin na sa 1987 Constitution, ang mismong bumuhay muli sa bicameralism sa Pilipinas matapos ipatupad ang unicameralism noong 1973. Malinaw po dito ang intensyon ng mga delegado upang panatilihin ang bicameralism sa ating kasalukuyang konstitusyon. Nararapat din po nating isaalang-alang na sa probisyon pagdating sa kapangyarihang maghayag ng pag-iral ng kalagayang digma o Declaration of State of War, sinasaad po ng 1987 Constitution, the Congress, by vote of 2/3 of both houses in joint session assembled, voting separately, shall have the sole power to declare existence of a state of war. Yan po ay nasa Seksyon 23, Artikulo 6. Mas malinaw pa po ito sa sikat ng araw, Ginoong Tagapangulo. Kung sa mismong pagdideklara ng kalagayang digma po, ay sinasabi na ang dalawang kapulungan na magkasamang magtitipon sa sesyon at magkahiwalay ang pagboto. Magkahiwalay. Nararapat lamang po na ito rin ang gamiting panuntuan sa pamamaraan ng pagboto ng mga mambabatas pagdating sa pag-amyenda ng saligang batas. Dahil po dito, iminumungkahi po ng inyong lingkod sapagkat ilis po inulit ng mga bihasa, mga magagaling na sa konstitusyon natin, ilang beses nilang inulit. Kanina sa hearing, sinasabi mismo nila na oversight. Oversight ito, talagang nakalimutan, talagang hindi na ilagay. Ilang beses po nilang inulit. Kaya ang akin pong mungkahi, Ginoong Pangulo, hindi po natin unang harapin yung usapin ng pagboto doon sa usapin ng voting separately. Sapagkat ito pong ating panukala, ating resolusyon, ating gustong ibahagi, ang lahat ng ito, kapag hindi na naman natuloy, halimbawa, wag naman sana ipahintulot ng Panginoon Diyos na matuloy na ang amenda ng economic provision. O halimbawa, hindi po natuloy, titigil na naman po ang usapin patungkol sa voting separately. Mananahimik na naman tayo. Itong 19th Congress, palalampasin po ba natin ang pagkakataon na sa atin mismo, tayo mismo, amendahan na natin yaang nasa Artikulo 17, Section 1. Tayo na po ang mag-amenda at ilagay na natin yung sinasabi ng mga eksperto sa batas kanina, sa saligang batas, sinasabi nila ng nakaligtaan. Kaya po tayo ay nagsulong kanina upang amendahan po mismo, upang matuldukan na po talaga ang kalituhang dulot ng probisyon na ito. Sa pamamagitan po yan, Ginoong Pangulo, na isang resolusyon ng aking hinihain kaninang umaga. Ayon nga po kay Professor Emeritus Dr. Gerardo P. Sicat mula sa School of Economics ng Universidad ng Pilipinas, merong mga pagkakamaling nakapaloob sa ating kasalukuyang konstitusyon na napagtanto lamang natin matapos ang ilang dekada ng pagtalima dito. Tama po si Dr. Sicat na kung ordinaryong batas lamang po ito ay napakadali ng maging proseso sa mga mungkahing susog. Subalit dahil ang supreme law of the land na po ang ating pinag-uusapan, hindi natin ito pwedeng basta-basta maisakatuparan. Ginoong Pangulo, ang akin pong salmo sa inyo at sa aking mga kasama, kasabay po sana nating talakayin ang patungkol po sa aking resolusyon na atin pong harapin na, ngayon na, itong patungkol sa voting separately. Sana po ay makasabay na ito sa ating pagdinig sa patungkol naman po sa pang-ekonomiyang probisyon. Sapagkat sa akin pong palagay, ito na po ang panahon upang linawin natin kung ano man po ang nakaligtaan ng mga bumuo ng 1987 Constitution. Tayo po ang maging daan upang malinawan, matigil na ang kalituhan, at tayo po magkaroon na ng katahimikan at hindi na maulit muli ang mga palitan ng salita, palitan ng mga press releases, sapagkat ito lamang po ang solusyon. Kapag ito ay naamyendahan natin ang Section 1 ng Article 17, matatapos na po ang usapin. Yan na po ang magbibigay ng closure na talagang ang ating saligang batas, ang pinagtitibay ng ating saligang batas ay bicameral. Ang dalawang house at ang dalawang house na ito ay may kanya-kanyang power, voting power. Hindi po pwedeng kailanman ay maging jointly. Yun lamang po. Maraming salamat po, Ginoong Pangulo, at mabuhay po ang Senado.
Maraming salamat sa ating kapatid, Robin Padilla.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to thank our guests for being here today, also to clarify the issue. Kailangan ba natin ng tsa-tsa para sabihin that we are open for business? Sabi nila sarado ang ating ekonomiya. Pero ang totoo, bukas naman talaga tayo sa foreign investors. We have made great strides in the past years liberalizing our economy without compromising our national security or leaving behind Filipino businesses. Would amending the public utilities provision in our Constitution open the economy or open a can of worms? Mahalagang mailatag sa diskusyon ang mga naging debate at deliberasyon ng Amended Public Service Act or PSA sa mga sektor na bukas sa kontrol ng dayuhan. We did this to encourage new players in sectors like airports, railways, expressways, and telecommunications. The idea was more competition means better services at better prices. All in all, a win for the Filipino consumers. Without changing the Constitution and guided by the long line of cases decided by the Supreme Court as to what public utilities really are, we carved out public utilities which will remain covered by the 60% Filipino ownership requirement from public services that were opened up by the PSA to full foreign investments. This is a repeat performance of what we did with EPIRA decades ago, where we carved out power generation from public utility. Hindi na po bago ito. Among those we retained under public utilities are industries known as natural monopolies or yung mga industriyang mas mura at cost-effective kung mag-isa lang ang service provider. These are various distribution, transmission, and pipeline systems carrying essentials such as electricity, water, and petroleum. Because of the nature of these natural monopolies, we needed to ensure the security and supply of these essential utilities. Siniguro natin na Pilipino pa rin ang may control sa mga ito at kailanman ay hindi makokontrol ng mga dayuhan. Ensuring seaports under Filipino ownership and control was also a matter of economic and national security. As an archipelago, seaports are the gateways for large-scale transport of people and cargo. First line of defense natin ang seaports laban sa smuggling, piracy, at sa kahit anong banta at seguridad sa ating teritoryo. Panghuli, Siniguro natin na Pilipino pa rin ang may control sa tradisyonal at dimakinang pampasaherong sasakyan para maprotektahan ang ating mga tsuper, lalo na ngayon hindi pa maayos ang PUV modernization program. With PSA, we protected the essentials while opening up others to much needed investments. Una na dito ang telecommunications na talagang nangangailangan ng mas pinalawig na kompetisyon para gumanda ang serbisyo at bumaba ang presyo. Through the PSA, we welcomed Starlink to come in and breathe new life to the industry. Actually, yan ang unang-unang permit na binigyan ng National Telecommunications Commission nung pinasa natin ang PSA. Starlink was 0001. At sa ngayon, ang Starlink ang nagbibigay ng signal sa mga unserved at underserved areas. Pati dun sa mga bases natin sa Pag-asa Island, sila ay dumidepende sa Starlink dahil hindi kaya ng mga local telecoms natin. Mabuti na lang meron dahil ang totoo nun, ang signal ng ibang bansa ay mas malakas pa dito sa ating mga teritoryong isla kaysa sa sarili nating mga signals. So kung hindi natin pinayagan ng Public Service Act, walang Starlink dun sa mga lugar na walang signal. Kaya yung mga sinasabi nila, kailangan natin buksan ang ating ekonomiya, sana pag-aralan muna nila ang itong napasa na nating batas. Bukod pa dito, binuksan din natin ang ating airlines at shipping lines to key investment, networks, and innovation. Kaya ngayon meron na uling United Airlines flight from the Philippines to the United States. Dahil nadagdagan na naman itong kumpiyansa ng mga mamumuhunan dito sa ating bansa. Napakahalaga nito at lalo na sumigla muli ang industriya sa revenge travel pagkatapos ng pandemya. Doon sa mga nagsasabing, kailangan natin buksan pa ang ating ekonomiya, yung mga iba bumubulong pa. Sana ang mga dayuhan ay payagan bumili ng lupa dito sa ating bansa. Dahil hindi naman nila madadala ang lupa sa kanilang bayan. Totoo naman yun, hindi nila kayang buhatin ng lupa. Pero isipin ninyo, kung ang kompetensya natin, ang exchange rate ng pera nila mas mataas dito sa mga Pilipino. Paano na yung mga bagong graduates natin? Paano na yung mga middle class? Makikipagkompetensya. Nung dumami nga ang pogo dito, naging napakamahal ng mga single units dito sa paligid ng Senado na ang aming mga staff na kung ikukumpara mo, mas malaki na ang sweldo kasi sa iba, ay nahihirapan pang magrenta o bumili ng unit. Bubuksan pa natin para sila ay makabili dito. Tignan din natin ang ating mga paliparan on how these can be revitalized through proper capital. We expect to see this realized in the upcoming NAIA rehabilitation. Kung titignan ninyo ang mga bidders natin dito sa NAIA, kasama dito yung mga nag-ooperate ng Incheon Airport, nag-ooperate ng airport sa Singapore, nag-ooperate ng airport sa Indonesia at sa New Delhi. Sapagkat na niliberalize na natin itong airport sector. As we opened up these sectors, we also place safeguards to protect our national security and interests. For example, we banned corporations owned by other governments from investing in public utilities and critical infrastructure. Halimbawa na lang, yung isang banyaga na kontrolado ang kanilang mga kumpanya ay hindi pwedeng magmay-ari ng telecommunications dito sa ating bansa. Di ko nababanggitin, alam ninyo kung sino yan. Nalagay din dito na tayo ay may reciprocity requirements for critical industries para patas ang kalakaran. Halimbawa, dito sa Pilipinas, pinapayagan natin 100% ownership ng telecommunications. Pero sa ibang bansa na gusto mag-invest dito, hindi naman nila tayo pinapayagan, hindi din natin sila papayagan dito. Diba, para meron din tayong proteksyon para sa atin. More importantly, binigyan natin ng kapangyarihan ng ating presidente na isuspend o pagbawalan ang kahit na anong transaksyon or investment na magbibigay control sa dayuhan sa isang public service kung ito ay may banta sa ating national security. So kung meron tayong isang bansa na pinagdududahan, kahit na sabihin natin bukas ang ating ekonomiya, pwede nating sabihin, sorry, kayo, hindi namin, wala kaming kumpiyansa sa inyo. Alongside PSA, we are positioned to attract foreign investments through the amended Foreign Investments Act and the Retail Trade Liberalization Act. The amended IRR of the Renewable Energy Act now allows up to 100% foreign investments in renewable energy resources. Filipino companies have partnered with foreign investors for the Mabini Wind Power Project in Batangas and solar power projects in the Pampanga Ecozone. While new investors are coming in, we have yet to see the full benefits of these laws. Sa makatuwid, bukas na ang ating ekonomiya. We have done so, as said by our esteemed statesman, former Senator Frank Drilon, without violating or amending the Constitution. Hindi natin kinailangan mag-con-con, con-as, o peking initiative. Look at the industries we carved out: power, water, seaports, petrol, PUVs. These are the remaining public utilities in the country. Yung Filipino ownership, critical for these sectors. Kung oo, bakit natin bubuksan sa kontrol ng dayuhan ang mga ito? As it stands now, RBH6 proposes opening through legislation all public utilities to foreign ownership, investments, and even management without the constitutional protection grounded on national security and domestic interest. Hindi lang ito usapin ng pagpasok ng foreign capital at businesses. Tignan din natin ang magiging epekto. Pwedeng tanggalin sa mga Pilipino ang control sa lahat ng sektor na nagbibigay serbisyo sa publiko. Pwedeng makontrol ng ibang bansa ang tubig, kuryente, seaports, gasolina, at public utility jeeps natin. Handa pa tayo dito? Kaya ba natin makipagkompetensya sila? Makakasabay ba ang Pilipino at local businesses sa pagpasok ng foreign competition sa lahat ng industriya? Makakasiguro ba tayo na papasok ang foreign investors, uunlad ang bayan? These are the questions needed to be answered. Nasa pag-amyenda ba ng konstitusyon o palagi na nating sinasabi, nasa pagpapalakad ng ating mga ahensya, pagbawas ng korupsyon kung hindi man tanggalin ng todo-todo, at paglimita ng bureaucracy. Amending the Public Service Act took several congresses and decades of data gathering and study. Countless hours of debates, interpellations, amendments, and discussions were poured in to craft just one particular carving out in our Constitution. Talagang pinag-aralan natin ang pangangailangan at epekto ng pagbukas ng bawat sektor. Kung dumaan sa butas ng karayom ang 86-year-old Public Service Act, mas lalong kailangan nating masunod, masuyod ang pag-amyenda ng ating 37-year-old na saligang batas. Kaya maraming salamat sa inyong pagdalo ngayon para liwanagin ang ating diskusyon ngayon at sa ating chairman sa pagpayag na magbigay ako ng pangbukas para dito sa ating diskusyon ngayong araw. Salamat po.
Thank you very much, Senator Po, for expounding on the law she sponsored, the public services, the amendments to the Public Services Act, which are very relevant to today's discussions. We'd like to acknowledge also the Deputy Minority Leader, the Chair of the Senate Committee on Women and Children, Senator Hontiveros. Good morning, ma'am. As well as other guests who have just arrived. Department of Finance Undersecretary Bayani Agabin. Morning, sir. DTI Undersecretary Fita Aldaba. Morning, ma'am. From the Australia-New Zealand Chamber of Commerce, Kimi Sui Duar. Morning. I hope I said that correctly. The ICT Assistant Secretary Renato Paraiso. Morning, sir. I think that's it. So we'd like to turn it over to our colleagues. Senator JV, if you have any, Senator Risa, any opening remark before we turn it over to our guests, please.
Yes, thank you, Chair, and salamat din, Sen. JD. Magandang umaga po muli sa ating lahat. Maiksi lang po dahil pagpapatuloy lang ng hearing, pero siguro magbibigay na ako ng preview ng aking mga concerns. Ayon mismo sa ilang resource persons sa huling pagdinig, Chacha is divisive and is not worth it. And I agree with them. Pero gusto ko din siyasatin yung sinabi ng isang resource person na the patrimony provisions in our Constitution as a business model are passé. Laos na ba talaga ang ating saligang batas na nangangalaga sa pang-Pilipinong likas at gawang yaman? Ngayon pong araw, pag-uusapan natin ang public utilities. Alam niyo po, ni-review ko ang mga discussion noong Public Services Act na katatalakay din ni Sen. Grace, and I saw the great care this Senate took when we identified the critical utilities that would still be under the protective mantle of the constitutional provisions on foreign ownership. Sa amyenda natin na ito, pati po ang critical utilities natin fair game na for future Congresses to give away. Yes, even to state-owned foreign companies which pose grave national security risks. Hindi ba't nagalit tayo noon nung lumabas na ang mga manual ng NGCP na may hawak sa ating state grid ay nakasulat sa Mandarin at hindi mabasa ng ating Pilipinong inhinyero? I'm also interested to find out if the problem really is the lack of foreign investments or our chronic failure to address anti-competitive monopolistic behavior. Imbes na basagin ng charter change ang monopolyo ng mga dominant domestic companies, papalitan lang ba sila ng mga dayuhang kumpanya? Ganun din, baka mas malala pa. Baka ang mangyari, tatanggalin natin ang state grid kay C, pero ibibigay naman kay C sa gitna ng malalang alitan sa West Philippine Sea. Naalala ko ang mga ito at naalala ko ang aking tito, the late nationalist economist Alejandro Lichauco, na sinabing imposible ang pag-unlad ng bansa kung kontrolado ng dayuhan ang ekonomiya na bumubuhay dito. A nation that is poor, dependent, exploited, and oppressed by others, he warned, quote, can only have a population of farmers and workers similarly poor, dependent, exploited, and oppressed, closed quote. Salamat po, Mr. Chair, and I'm ready to engage later.
Yes, thank you, Senator Risa. Senator JV,
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Anyway, we're here.
Hill Capital. So, Dr. Carlos, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I was taking down notes earlier as I listened to Senator Po and Senator Hontiveros, and I'd like to address the issues that they have raised. I think I'd like to take off from the point of view of social scientists who's looking at this from a macro standpoint. So I will not go into the nitty-gritty because all my colleagues here have already addressed many dimensions of the issue. I think the first question of Senator Grace is, do we need to change the Constitution to declare that we're open for business? And the quick and dirty answer there would be no, because you already are making so many legislative actions to open up the economy. But I think the challenge there is it opening up enough, or are we addressing really what we want to happen? Here, I'd like to go into a bit of epistemology, if you don't mind, which is, when you establish something and you say that you know something, that means you have identified the composite of variables which will bring about a particular result, isn't it? Now here, as I listen to the very intelligent comments around the table and those who are joining us virtually, and I noticed that we are not able to categorize our variables into most critical, less critical, and so on. In other words, we don't have an ordinal list where one is first, second, etc. And that one, as I agree with Dr. Fabella, cannot be an article of faith. It has to be empirically grounded. So however much we believe in these things, as a social scientist, if they are not empirically grounded, ay laway lang po yan. Okay, so I think because all the senators have their own research component, I would like them to pay attention to grounding all these claims. It's only if we have the hard evidence, the evidence conditions that will support them, that we can declare that we know something. That's the reason why you will notice we're shooting here, there, and everywhere. It's because we're not able to categorize them into the most important, less important, etc. Okay, of course, remember I've been part of the cabinet for X number of months as National Security Advisor. One of the things I put together there would be to present to our president in one cabinet meeting, I think it was late October or early November, a national strategy. Why do we need the national strategy? And this is where I had, had to cross swords with one of my colleagues, the NEDA head. Sabi niya, ba't mo pa kailangan national strategy? Andiyan na nga yung NEDA plan. Sabi ko, tinuro ko din siya. Sabi ko, bakit naman sa national plan mo wala man lang isang single line about national security? And because I was the vice chair of the NTF-ELCAC also at the time, bakit wala man lang dyan nakatutok tungkol doon sa mga barangay natin at anong gagawin dito sa mga natitira pa na mga influence barangay? Wala talaga doon. I mean, i-google niyo yan at saliksikan niyo yan. Okay, what am I saying? If we're just shooting here, there, and everywhere, and we don't have anything, a big picture that will crochet together, that will stitch together all these things, then we don't know what to do. In terms of konti na nga ang salapi mo, kung saan-saan mo pa nilalagay. Kapag the national strategy ka, pag konti ang salapi mo, alam mo, ito yung number one, yun ang una mong bigyan ng pansin. Ganun din siguro dito, no? Bakit tayo masyadong nag-rely sa foreign investment? What about domestic investment? Hindi ba natin nakita yung sinabi na nga, yung regulatory framework, yung sinabi ni Dr. Villegas kanina, kahit ang inyong mga domestic investor ay sinasakal din ng over-regulation ng ating gobyerno. Parang ang unang assumption mo ikaw ay magnanakaw, saka mo na i-prove otherwise, no? Bakit ganon? In other words, well, we are so much banking in foreign direct investment. We should also bank on our local investors and talagang bigyan niya sila ng alagwa para talagang magawa nila ang kanilang ginagawa. Bigyan ko kayo ng example, no? My former boss here, Senator Tolentino at the MMDA, I was there with him since 2010 as one of his consultants for the traffic management. Dines namin, Senator, I don't know kung nakwento ko na sa iyo to, kung paano yung bureaucracy natin as been identified by other resource persons, no, is really one of the major obstacles to why no investment is coming in. Merong isang gripo dyan na nagtutulo, no? So sabi ko, ang bilis na, ang madali naman bumili ng gripo, parang 200 pesos lang. Sabi ko, sundan natin kung paano magbili ng gripo. Alam niyo ba kung gaano yun? 4 na buwan. Tinrace namin ito, Senator Tolentino, 4 na buwan at 26 signatures para po makabili ng gripo. Gusto ko lang to make the point na the bureaucracy really matters. You have a Byzantine bureaucracy, and I have seen posts of foreign investors telling you that there are two major things, critical variables that matter to them, are Byzantine bureaucracy and the level of corruption. Yung ownership ko, they don't matter. By the way, tama si Dr. Fabella. Ownership by Filipinos is an article of faith. It doesn't matter who owns it. Sabi ko nga sa telco, galing pa siya sa Jupiter, basta magpagawa sa talaga ng internet, okay lang. Does ownership matter? No, not anymore. In the university, we're telling our students, we're training you to be citizens of the world. We are breaking down all the boundaries of the artificial nation state. We already made commitments in ASEAN for regional integration. Why, for heaven's sakes, I was always so preoccupied on, keeping the nation state. It's one of the scourges of humanity, if I may say so. So, last point, yung Filipino first po, tama po si Senator Hontiveros. Pasay na po yan. It should be rendered obsolescent, no? Bakit Filipino first? Because once upon a time in the past, we tried to, to divest ourselves of all the colonial things that chained us, no, to the former colonial rulers of our country. Wag na po tayong Filipino first. No one study I have the country. Wag na po tayong Filipino first. No one study I have seen thus far has demonstrated quite creditably that ownership by Filipinos work. I challenge anyone here around the table, the social scientists. Meron bang ganyan? Wala po. Ownership doesn't matter. No? But what we really want is, in fact, I had suggested in one of my papers that if our economic managers cannot, in fact, lower or eradicate the 21% of their big legacies na sinabi mo, no, na mga poor, magha tayo po ng international group of economic managers. We pay them depending on the percentage of increment that they are going to contribute to GDP. I know this is an iconoclastic viewpoint, but for God's sake, we have to be iconoclasts now. We are the fifth most mineralized countries in the world. We have millions of professionals. We should be embarrassed that we have 21% who are poor. Tama ba, Dr. Villegas? Tama, di ba? So I think, let me go back to the issue of a national strategy. I address this also to the military. Several times they have asked me to help them design their strategy for the Air Force, for the Philippine Marines, etc. Sabi ko, saan ba kayo nakatukod yung strategy nyo? Meron bang National Defense Plan? O kung ang isip nyo lang yan, saan manggagaling yung National Defense Plan, Senator po? Hindi ba manggagaling yan sa national strategy? Dibuho yan eh. It's a big, big picture. And siguro lastly, sorry sa Senator Angara, medyo nagsosobra na ata ako sa time ko. Senator po, you mentioned something about banning certain countries from ownership. And are you referring to China?
In the Public Service Act, any country that the President or the National Security Council views as a threat to us is actually eliminated from or banned from owning certain critical infrastructure, telecommunications, for example, I believe airports, etc. And also, countries that don't reciprocate or allow us also the same type of ownership in their country would not be allowed. Those are some of the safeguards we put as a compromise to those who are a little bit wary about this Public Service Act being open.
Yeah, with all due respect, I agree with the reciprocity, but the first one I don't. Because if you have a strict regulatory framework, then it can be a to whom it may concern. So I think we should not ban XYZ, whichever country. So thank you very much.
Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Dr. Carlos. Senator Risa, yes?
Salamat, Mr. Chair. Just a quick correction for the record. With all due respect, I certainly did not say that Filipino first is a passé policy. In fact,
One
I
of your
believe,
source persons, I stand corrected.
thank you, ma'am. In fact, I believe that Filipino first is a positive and dynamic principle in formulating and constantly updating our economic policy. And lastly, Mr. Chair, at this point, if 60 to 100% ownership in Filipino hands doesn't matter anyway in the big picture, then let's keep that in Filipino hands and work on the real problems identified both by those opposed to and supportive of RBH 6. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Risa.
Mr. Chair, just a quick comment.
Yes, Senator
I'd like to thank also Dr. Carlos for bringing up something that we haven't really discussed in our minds being focused on foreign direct investments. It's true, local businesses are also suffering. What we're trying to do is we're actually hunting in the zoo, like the ones that are complying with the laws, paying taxes, are the ones being audited, while the ones that are in the informal economy getting away with so much, we don't focus our attention on. So thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you, Senator Risa, Senator Po. It's definitely we're not abandoning the Filipino first. In fact, Congress just passed the Tatak Pinoy strategy, which is an attempt at industrial policy, albeit somewhat belated for the region. No?
Sponsored and authored by our chairman.
Thank you for the salamat sa patalastas. Thank you. Thank you. We'd like to
Senator, just make a final comment. As a social scientist, I'd like an article of faith to have empirical evidence. We cannot work on an article of faith. Filipino first policy should be rendered obsolescent.
Thank you. Thank you for your opinion. We'd like to hear from Mr. Julian Payne, the president of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, who's been our guest in the past for the CREATE law and the other investment laws. Morning, sir.
Good morning. Mr. Chairman, honorable senators. I'm going to speak on behalf of the Joint Foreign Chambers of Commerce. Then I will make one brief comment on behalf of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. And I have some colleagues here from the European Chamber and the Australia, New Zealand who may wish to add some. First of all, we thank the subcommittee for inviting us to comment on this resolution. We're honored to respond to the committee. The Joint Foreign Chambers of Commerce of the Philippines is a business advocacy coalition. We know that. It supports and promotes open international trade, free investment, and improved conditions of business. That's what we advocate. We don't advocate anything more. That's where we focus. The Joint Foreign Chambers of Commerce supports the easing of restrictions on foreign direct investment wherever this is possible. And I'll make a caveat to that in a moment. We are of the opinion that the removal of economic restrictions would facilitate increased foreign direct investment in sectors where such investment is currently restricted. We recognize that the government's mandate, and indeed duty, in all countries is to protect national interests through some restrictions on FDA. That happens in every country. In this respect, we note that most national economies, this interest is protected by use of legislation or executive action, not in constitutions. The advantage of using legislation or executive action is that with these forms of regulation, both the legislature and or the executive can quickly adjust to changing business conditions and the international environment. Whether this is required by changes in technology, treaties, or just new opportunities for business. In recent years, the Congress, in its wisdom, has done just that with respect to amendments of PSA, the Foreign Investment Act, the Retail Sales Legislation Act. Our neighbor country, Indonesia, opened more than 200 sectors to foreign investment, again by the same technique. We have noted various past proposals to remove constitutional restrictions to foreign investment, including removing these altogether, or as an alternative, to insert the phrase, unless otherwise provided by law, as proposed by the resolution, for sectors advertising, basic education, and so on. This second alternative provides the Congress the power to adjust restrictions as it deems necessary. While the second alternative may not be as strong a signal to foreign investments as the first, it makes possible, if the Congress so decides, to further ease restrictions or not, that would facilitate foreign direct investment. The Philippine economy is now more integrated with the global economy than it was over 30 decades ago. The country has joined the WTO, the ASEAN Economic Community, and RCEP most recently. It has free trade agreements with Japan, Korea, European Free Trade Association, and will probably need to negotiate further FTAs, such as with the Comprehensive Trans-Pacific Partnership, to remain competitive and to exploit these opportunities for the Filipinos. Many of these developments emphasize the need for free movement of capital and a level playing field between foreign and domestic investors. And that gets to the core of the question of the economic provisions. That is the statement of the JFC. I would like to make one comment on behalf of the Canadian Chamber. It seems to us we have two questions before us, and they're quite distinct. One is the question of restrictions in various sectors or not. This was made a point by Attorney Aguinaldo. It could range from 100% to 0% in any sector. The second question is quite a different one, is where are the restrictions going to be set, in the Constitution or in legislation? Now, the reality of the business world today is things are changing very rapidly. 30 years ago, we did not have online education. We did not have online advertising. The conditions have changed, and they will change faster and faster as we move forward. And I think it's imperative that the committee consider which is the most appropriate body to adjust to and propose restrictions, whether they be 100%, 60-40, or 0. There are two separate questions. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I would ask whether my colleagues wish to add anything. Thank you. Salamat po.
Yes, Mr. Florian Gotain, the Executive Director of the European Chamber of Commerce. Thank you, Mr. Payne.
Mr. Chairman, we're really honored to be here today, and especially we feel privileged as foreigners to speak here in front of this committee. Just to reiterate, basically, as European Chamber of Commerce, we fully support the statement that was just done by my colleague, Julian Payne. again, just reiterating that amending the constitution is purely a Filipino matter, that we appreciate that we have been invited. And if the Filipino people decide to amend the constitution, we would actually be in favor of removing the economic restrictions from the constitution. If you look at, again, coming from what my colleague Mr. Bain said, if you look at recent amendments to PSA, to RTLA, FIA, but also the DOJ opinion on the implementing rules and regulations of the Renewable Energy Act, have really created a more conducive business environment for foreign investors to come in. And as you clearly can see also in the last 1.5 years, this has really opened the floodgates for foreign direct investments, in particular also coming from Europe when it comes to renewable energy projects. So you can really see that what is being done here in the Senate and the Congress has really a huge impact also then on how foreign businesses react to it. If, I think it was earlier mentioned by Dr. Villegas, this will have the same impact on education and advertising. We don't know. Maybe it's more about the quality of investments there when it comes to education, to improve the level of education or the offer of education here in the country as well, because this is also critical for the competitiveness of the country, as well as then also for our investors here, to have qualified Filipino workers, especially also when it comes to new jobs, green jobs that we don't have yet here in the country. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chair, just as a
Yeah,
follow-up,
thank you, Mr. Godin. Yes, Senator Po.
with the foreign chambers, when we passed the PSA, I believe you were quite jubilant about it, right? What's the feedback among in your community when we passed the PSA?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman and Madam Senator, it was a very positive feeling actually that, after 80 plus years, this law has finally been amended. And as I mentioned earlier, it really has contributed to the attractiveness of the Philippines among the foreign investors.
So did you see any improvement in terms of interest and actual investments that came in after it?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I can just give you the example of the European Chamber. We grew last year by more than 130 members. We are altogether 800 members, and just last year we increased our membership, new foreign investors coming in by 130 new companies.
Is there now concern because of this issue on amending the Constitution with regards to our foreign investors being a little bit hesitant because of the issues surrounding this now?
Well, I have to be honest, we got some calls from some of our members following the news and the political debate about how this might unfold or in which direction it could actually move further. So there is some uncertainty out there, yes.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Duarte, would you care to add to that, or is that your position as well?
I represent the European Chamber as well, and I think my colleague Florian already stated. I might add one sentence, is that
Please.
We are very honored to be here. We understand that is a Filipino debate, and we don't want to be, let's say, deeply involved in promoting solution A or solution B. But we are also very honored that we have the chance to put our positions. So, but in a sense, that this could be an opportunity to awake interest from more foreign investments in the country, knowing that, and I hear we can talk for the European investments. So, for 100% investments in Southeast Asia, only 4% come to the Philippines, and we need to work together to increase this number. And everyone needs to contribute. The European Chamber from one side to attract, but also the country to accept and welcome foreign investment. So that's my just add on the topic. Thank you.
Well, that's a useful statistic. Thank you, Mr. Duarte. Ms. Duar, care to say anything for the New Zealand and Australian Chamber of Commerce?
Same position as my fellow JFC colleagues as well. We are very supportive of coming into the country. Australia, New Zealand, especially Australia now has launched their economic strategic partnership for the next 17 years with Asia up until 2040. So we have also seen an uptick of Australian interest wanting to come over. So same position as Dan. Thank you.
Thank you. That's very brief. Dr. Angeles, care to comment on the provisions we have? Doctor, yeah.
And perhaps, Dr. Angeles has been a valuable resource during our public services bill hearing. And I would like to hear if perhaps he feels now compelled that we should open up other public services, public utilities, or are we okay so far with the PSA?
Yes, please
Based
go
on
ahead.
your observation.
Please go ahead, sir. Yeah.
Honorable Chair and members of the committee and distinguished individuals in attendance. First, perhaps as regards, first I had the honor of working with Senator Po and her colleagues regarding the Public Service Act amendments, that law was founded on what we believe to be the appropriate interpretation of the provision, that in fact public utility regulation was focused on the regulation of natural monopolies and their ills, and that the remaining most of the what were remaining sectors that were classified as public utilities in the Public Service Act amendments were considered to be natural monopolies. Those specifically that are considered by the economic literature to be still natural monopolies would be electric power transmission, distribution, water pipeline distribution sewerage, petroleum distribution through pipeline specifically. And as I'm elated to note that from the foreign chambers that this has been helpful. That said, I would like to address a few of the points mentioned earlier. While I understand that Professor Carlos believes that foreign equity restrictions are irrelevant, I would like to address that by 2 points. First, regarding the theoretical literature and empirical literature on control premiums. If, in fact, control was irrelevant, that control would not be worth a premium. And in fact, the financial economics literature has proven that there's in fact a control premium. Number 2, on the theoretical aspects of the legal matters, certainly, I think it's fairly well known that in corporation law, that certain basic fundamental decisions must be taken with 2/3 vote of stockholders, such as amendment of articles of incorporation, as regards sale of substantially all of the business, etc. So these are matters which would be certainly important from a theoretical aspect. Now, from the empirical aspect, we have seen that with the Public Service Act amendments, in fact, there has been, and the renewable energy IRR amendments, there have been there has been a higher interest in investment, and at the same time, pledges made, which I understand, as Professor Villegas has pointed out, have resulted in at least about $14 billion worth, and that has translated to, and a substantial portion of that was in renewable energy. Now, that said, I would say that, and I will confine myself specifically to the issue of public utilities, I would say that, as you mentioned, as the chairman and has repeatedly mentioned, uncertainty is something that is worth considering. And I think this is also mentioned by the joint foreign chambers. Now, it cannot be denied that there are 2 pending Supreme Court petitions challenging the constitutionality of the Public Service Act. And while I believe that the Public Service Act amendments law will pass muster, that said, the Supreme Court still has the final, in the end, the final arbiter of the meaning of the Constitution and its metes and bounds. So for that reason, I believe that the amendment adding unless provided by law would be helpful in addressing the uncertainty which the chairperson has in fact pointed out. I also do agree with the good Senator Po that there are a number of safeguards that our policymakers, our wise policymakers have added, which I think will help to mollify their concerns. One of them is the state-owned enterprise prohibition, which affects public utilities and critical infrastructure. As in fact, it was in fact asked in the last bar exam, not even 1%, there was a proposed 1% investment. But even under that state-owned enterprise prohibition, post-effectivity, there is no state-owned enterprise that can invest in public utilities and critical infrastructure. There, as you also mentioned, there's a reciprocity provision. And at the same time, there's an information security provision, which requires those engaged in the business operation of telecommunications to secure those relevant international certifications for information security, and prohibits cooperation as regards providing sensitive information, personal information. So if we are to so moving forward, I believe that there are quite a number of salutary provisions there that would help to mollify concerns for foreign investment in these sensitive sectors. May it please the members of the honorable committee.
Very much. A lot of useful points there, Dr. Angeles. Senator Po, I think, wants to interject, and then Dr. Villegas is also raising his hand. So,
I'd like to address my question to our Justice Carpio, having been a member of the Supreme Court as one of the justices. As you know, the Public Service Act is now being questioned before the Supreme Court. And maybe that's also one of the reasons why our chairman here and some of our colleagues would like to strengthen the provisions of the Public Service Act by amending this through the RBH 6. What is your view on it, sir? Is there a legitimate reason why we should go through this process, or do you feel that the Supreme Court will eventually resolve it soon?
Well,
Mr. Chairman,
I'm in favor of
I've connected po
is
dun
it
sa...
connected? With your permission, Justice Carpio. Senator Binay, yes.
Mr. Chairman, and would the passage of this resolution make the pending cases in the Supreme Court moot and academic?
Thank you.
Thank you,
Justice.
Mr.
Thank you.
yes, I'm in favor of the amendment that we include in the economic provisions the phrase unless otherwise provided by law. But I would like to add subject to reciprocity, just like in the PSA, amended PSA. Now, on the issue in the Supreme Court, I think this would help. If you amend the provision now to add unless otherwise provided by, then that will settle the issue. Because, you know, the way I look at it, the interpretation of public utility is an interpretation reserved for the highest court of the land, because we are interpreting a phrase in the Constitution, and the Supreme Court will always say, we have that authority. Congress cannot decide a case by defining a provision in the Constitution the way they want it. We will say what that provision means, because that is judicial power. So the issue is, does public utility include transportation? Does it include telecommunication? For the longest time, that has been the case. And whenever we say speak of public utility, we always mean transportation, telephone, and that is the way the framers of the Constitution understood it. So it boils down to who can interpret the Constitution finally, the Supreme Court, or can Congress interpret it by legislation? So that is the issue now. If I were in the court, I would say it's the Supreme Court who can interpret the meaning of public utility. But you will say, we will define public utility under a law. So there is now a conflict. So to settle that, just add there in the provision of the Constitution, unless otherwise provided by law. That would fix it. Because my position is the Supreme Court is the final interpreter of the phrase public utility. Because that is the reason for existence of the Supreme Court, to interpret the provisions of the Constitution. Congress cannot take that power away by saying, we will interpret it in a law. That's exactly the issue now in the Supreme Court. So I'm for this provision, but just to add a phrase subject to reciprocity, because we cannot open our economy to Vietnam, to China, to Indonesia, when they are close to us. I mean, it should be equal, because we are sovereign states. We should be treated like they're co-equals. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Justice Carpio. Tama yun, di dapat tayo magpalugi. Senator Tolentino, on a related point, with your permission, Dr. Villegas.
Chairman, germane to the question of Senator Binay. So in effect, it would be, the question was whether it would render the case moot and academic. The answer implies the proposition that it would have a retroactive, persuasive effect among the members of the bench. Is that the correct interpretation, Your Honor, Justice Carpio?
You add the phrase unless otherwise provided by law. That will solve the problem, because the Constitution itself tells everybody that you can now determine the meaning of public utility.
But the PSA amendment was passed prior to this process. So will that have a bearing on that? If the Supreme Court would release its decision within the next few months, and if looking at if there is a timetable, sans bullying, this would be addressed by a plebiscite within the next few months. How would that jive with the persuasiveness?
Well, I have no idea when they will decide that case. So, but for me to play it safe, it will be better to to put the phrase unless otherwise provided by law. Thank you.
Thank you, Justice.
Thank you very much, Senator. Back to you, Dr. Villegas.
Yes, I'd like to emphasize the importance of what Mr. Payne asked. Should restrictions, Filipino first, which will always be relevant, be in the Constitution or should they be legislated? And I'd like to give you a background about why those of us who drafted the Constitution really made our Constitution a series of legislation. I'm the first one to say that sooner or later, we have to amend this very imperfect Constitution of 1987.
That is a very important question, so I would love to hear from you, sir.
Because 1986 was not the appropriate time to write with serenity, peace, and quiet the basic law of the land. The whole nation, including us, were traumatized by the last turbulent years of the dictatorship, and not to mention the revolution. So emotions were high, and the idea was, let's produce a document that will make sure that the dictator will never come back. And so our constitution is really an anti-Marcos constitution. And we jam-packed it with so many provisions that you will not find in most basic laws. And that is why one day I would like to see this constitution amended. The question right now is timing. I'm of the opinion that now is the time. But sooner or later, we must revise and remove all those restrictions and make sure that in a VUCA environment, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, we give the legislature precisely the freedom to be flexible. So we will always debate about Filipino first restrictions, and they will always be necessary. But the question is, should they appear in the basic law of the land?
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Nancy, yes.
So, Dr. Villegas, parang today is not the right day to change the Constitution.
Yes, I already said why, because we have to first address the biggest problem. 21% of our fellow Filipinos are going to bed hungry every
When
day.
is the right time to do it, Dr.
I was saying,
Villegas? Yeah.
if the president is able to achieve those two targets, bring down the poverty incidence to single digit, which Secretary Balikasan is always saying, that by 2028, we will see a single digit. And how do you do that? I already mentioned. Make sure that we increase the rate of investment to GDP to 30%. And you can do that only because of lack of local capital. This will not be always. Probably when we already are $10,000 capital, we will have enough capital to really implement Filipino first. But I'm talking about the secretaries today. We don't have the capital for Filipinos to invest long-term in these infrastructures. So my feeling is, because I'm optimistic that this administration will be able to achieve their target, probably by 2028, make the plebiscite simultaneous with the national elections. And who knows, probably the next administration can tackle that issue. But I repeat, our Constitution of 1997 is a very imperfect one.
Thank you. That's a very, it's a humble and honest, frank assertion, because some people are tied to their work, but you're obviously not. And you're, as an intellectual, you've assessed it very honestly. We appreciate that, Dr. Villegas. I think this is the right time to insert some data we've received from the Senate Economic Planning Office, or the SEPO, of 18, because we're talking about whether these restrictions should be in the Constitution or in ordinary legislation. And according to the Senate, the SEPO, the Senate Economic Planning Office, of 18 countries surveyed, it is only the Philippines which has the economic regulations or restrictions on nationality in their constitution. The following do not: Brunei, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, Thailand, Vietnam, Singapore, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, France, Germany, Italy, United Kingdom, and the United States. So these countries deal with these issues of nationality in their legislation and not in their constitutions. So that may be one of the reasons why many of those surveyed do not talk about the Constitution, because it is irrelevant to their experience, Your Honors. So next we'll have Attorney Ocampo. Attorney Ocampo is a practitioner who, for tax and corporate law, who has lived in Kazakhstan and lived and practiced investment law in Kazakhstan and Cambodia and Vietnam. Or just
Yes, I
Cambodia.
did some work in
Yes, please. We look forward to hearing from you, Attorney Ocampo.
Thank you very much, Honorable Chair. And of course, I'd like to say I'm honored to be able to contribute to this discussion in two ways. One, as the Honorable Chair said, as a lawyer who's worked in other ASEAN jurisdictions and even in Central Asia and Eastern Europe. Second, also as a managing partner of a small law firm that works primarily with foreign investors. So as the Honorable Chairman said, I've actually worked in very exotic locations. So Kazakhstan, I was a tax advisor in Budapest in Hungary, and I've worked with a regional law firm. It's called TFDL. I did some work on Cambodia and Myanmar, Vietnam, taxation and investment. And what I hope to contribute is that, in my observation, the decision of a company to invest in a certain location, it's almost the same everywhere else. So in, let's say, an American company, you would have what maybe we can call here a sponsor. It's one person in the company that thinks, okay, there's an opportunity in the Philippines. And then that company would normally also have an investment committee. And that sponsor, that person, will then go to the investment committee and defend his proposal to invest, say, in the Philippines or Vietnam or Cambodia. One of the things that is very important there is his defense of whether or not a certain hurdle rate would be met. So it's an investment rate that is based on the capital cost and borrowing cost of that company, right? So that person will say, yes, I will go. It would be higher than this certain hurdle rate. So let's invest in the Philippines or Vietnam or Cambodia or what have you. The next step usually is a legal study, what the investors call a market entry memo. In that market entry memo, law firms such as ours, we are asked, okay, what are the rules? How do we set up? If the investment goes awry, how do we exit? Is there a predictable legal regime? So that's the usual route. And then if the investment committee is happy, they do some final calculations and they put the money in, right? So I'd like to echo actually what the Honorable Supreme Court Justice Carpio said earlier, that among the things that impact investment is the efficiency of the bureaucracy, because bureaucratic efficiency is actually among those that they factor into when they determine if they're going to be able to set up immediately, will they be able to set up easily? If they exit, will there be costs? The other issue would be on predictability, because when they set that hurdle rate, when they calculate the hurdle rate, they make a lot of economic assumptions. And so a sudden change in the law or a sudden change in the interpretation by the Supreme Court of a law would put that calculation in danger. Again, also just my observation, it's this thing, it's the hurdle rate. It's whether or not the company will make more money than its cost of capital is the one that's important to these investors. So again, two things, it's bureaucracy and predictability, right? And at the risk of sounding like a fan of Justice Carpio, I'd also like to echo what he said about the PSA matter. As a matter of fact, I was also speaking with Dr. Angeles earlier about it. The problem really is that, yes, it was passed and it's a great piece of legislation. Our firm actually benefited a bit from the Public Service Act amendment and the change to the renewable energy, because those are our clients. And they were very enthusiastic when the Public Service Act was amended and when the DOJ and DOE revised the IRR for RE renewable energy investments. The other one, by the way, is the amendment on the Retail Trade Act. That one actually also created some excitement with the foreign law firms that we work with and foreign clients. But going back to the PSA, I think during the time that it came out, and we would have discussions, the practitioners, on whether the challenge to the Supreme Court, or what's going to happen to this. I think many practitioners think that the validity would likely be confirmed, but there's always that risk that, as Justice Carpio said, it's a very important constitutional issue. Can the legislature actually define what's in the Constitution, or can the Supreme Court ignore that definition and look to other sources to determine what public utility is? And just to make sure that there's no such risk, it may be good to actually adopt the changes proposed, as otherwise provided by law, or as Justice Carpio said, maybe you can include also reciprocity. in the end, with regard to the issue of whether or not the national ownership restriction should be in the Constitution, in the end, it's about trust. Do we trust future House of Representatives and future Senates to act responsibly and promote the national welfare when they prescribe these levels or threshold for Filipino ownership? So I think if there's something else that I would be able to contribute to this honorable committee, I'm happy to assist sometime in the future. But as of now, I think I can end my discussion there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Senator Risa, yes.
Just a quick manifestation in response to one of the later points raised by Attorney Ocampo. Tingin ko nga, and this is related to one of the questions I'll raise when my turn comes later. Sa tingin ko po, sobrang critical nga na hindi lang ipagkatiwala, carte blanche, sa mga future na hindi pa natin kilalang mga kongreso ang ganitong ka-critical na usapin. Salamat, Mr. Chair.
I guess it's a debate about political maturity also, di ba?
Very important.
If you don't give that power to institutions, then when do you become mature? Di ba?
Correct,
If you
correct.
assume immaturity. Dr. Villegas.
No, that's a very important point. When we wrote the Constitution, who were we, 50 members of the Commission, who would say that we are the only ones who can protect the Philippine welfare? It's, I think, unfair to say we don't trust the future. What about us? Do they trust us? Who are we?
I trust you, sir. I trust you.
No, but
I trust.
precisely when I was against so many of these restrictions, they would say, "Oh, we cannot trust the future legislature." But do you think we are trustable? We are trustable.
I think it's part of our journey to being a mature political democracy.
Exactly.
Uh,
So I
How much
think
power do we entrust to our legislators who are elected by the people, and they are our representatives at the end of the day,
Exactly.
whether we like what they're doing or not. So that's where elections come in, and we make our choices. Yes, Commissioner Sarmiento.
There is mention by Attorney Jude about general welfare as a guide for legislators and lawmakers, and reference is made by Justice Carpio to reciprocity. There is a provision that will guide us actually in the article on the national economy, addressing these 2 points. It's in section 13 that provides the state shall pursue a trade policy that serves the general welfare and utilizes all forms and arrangements of exchange on the basis of equality and reciprocity. So this addresses or answers the question or the suggestion of Justice Carpio and the points raised by Attorney Chun. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you.
Chair.
Thank you very much for pointing that out, Commissioner Sarmiento. Next, we'll have Senator Risa.
Salamat, Mr. Chair. Just an additional brief manifestation. On the matter of trust and institutions, paalala lang sa atin na in the Constitution itself, there are well-defined processes to amend the Constitution itself, wide open for CONCON, congressional, and citizen participation. And again, these are also elements of that process of political maturation. Salamat, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. I think Dr. Fabella is raising his hand. So, but before we recognize him, we just want to highlight that point of Commissioner Sarmiento earlier during his position paper, where he said that there are 11,000 amendments proposed to the U.S. Constitution over 200 or so years, and only 27 have been adopted. So, if we average it out, there are an average of 46 amendments proposed a year, and an successful amendment every 8.7 years. Just to, in the Philippines, since 1987, there have been, according to the House, there have been 358 proposed cha-cha measures or charter change measures over the last 37 or 38 years, which is roughly an amendment proposed once every 10 years. And this is, if we succeed, this will be the first amendment. So I guess if we're talking about political maturity, we have to ask ourselves, is the process we're going through a part of our political maturity? Will definitely engaging in it, talking about it in front of our people in an open and transparent manner, nakakatulong yon sa ating taong bayan na karamihan, let's face it, hindi naman mahalaga sa kanila yung ating saligang batas. So I think in that sense, it is an educational process for our people. And I think this is the first time we've really gone in depth in terms of discussing the economic provisions, because we've been sidetracked by, often the discussion has not been focused, which is why this representation has really wanted to focus on the 3 provisions at hand. Although we welcome the opinions of our eminent personalities, because it's very rare that we have them all in the same room. So thank you very much. Dr. Fabella, can we hear from you, sir? You're raising your hand.
Thank you very much. This is on trust, and moving on from Dr. Villegas' manifestation about his idea, about his thinking of the Constitution. Let me just comment that the 1987 Philippine Constitution, I think, this is, I'm not a constitutionalist in any way, I think fails the simple aesthetics of brevity on the separation of principles and instruments. The reason why the Philippine 1987 Constitution is rather lengthy is because of the inclusion of instruments rather than principles and values into the body of the Constitution. The section, for example, state policies, contains 27 sections, all of which, let me repeat, all of which constrain future governments in certain directions. What it tells us citizens is that the framers of the 1987 Constitution harbored a deep distrust for future governments, and that is including the current generation, to act with prudence, and so their hands should be tied. But this also limits their capacity to respond to changing social, physical, and technological environments. In other words, resilience be damned. So there are provisions in the Constitution that are also economic, but which we are not going to include in the cha-cha. But I wish that they would be included. For example, the issue of land policy and the comprehensive agrarian reform program. Again, I reiterate the idea that laws are rather easy to reverse, and therefore it doesn't have the binding, credible commitment value of the lifting of the restrictions of the Constitution. The PSA may well be declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, which is why it's best to have the lifting of the restrictions of the on foreign ownership in the Constitution. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Padilla. Now we'll go to Dr. Emmanuel Doy Santos. He's with us online. He's based in Australia, and he's an advisor to the Australian government and local governments on political and economic matters. Dr. Santos, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
And honorable members of the committee and the Senate, for this opportunity to shed light on the matter at hand. Next slide, please, if the slides are there. I have a slide presentation that I'll take you through.
There are actually no slides. Can we ask the
Oh, sorry.
committee secretary to
Anyway, I have
put up
prepared
some
some
slides?
remarks, so whenever they can load it there, I'll just take it from wherever it starts. So, good morning to you all. The 1987 Constitution, some general remarks first, Mr. Chair. The 1987 Constitution is only the latest in a long line since 1935 to contain restrictions to foreign ownership in its provisions. But the origins of these restrictions even predate that. The 1899 Malolos Constitution did not contain any restrictions to foreign participation in our economy. Ironically, by a strange twist of fate, it was the US annexation of the Philippines that caused these restrictions on foreign ownership to be inserted in the Philippine Organic Act of 1902. By the way, I have to state at the start that I'm here in my private capacity and my opinions are mine alone, do not represent that of my employer. Thank you. So, as a concession to the Democratic House members from the South in the US, fearful that cheaper goods, especially sugar, from the Philippines would flood US markets, American citizens and corporations were prevented from holding vast tracts of land, engaging in mining, banking, and utility franchises in the Philippine Organic Act. The US colonial government then sought to appease the Filipino revolutionaries by offering them land through land reform under Governor Taft. However, the Treaty of Paris required the US to compensate the Spanish friars for these lands that the Katipuneros had occupied during the revolution. This made the cost of owning productive assets unaffordable for most beneficiaries because the US Treasury made them pay for these costs. This is from a paper by Aaron Marr, because you can't see the slides yet, published by the Harvard Business School in 2008. As a result, Mr. Chair, land ownership became concentrated in a wealthy class of local principales, more concentrated among the top quartile compared to the Spanish era, meaning to say, land ownership became even more concentrated perversely under the US attempt to engage in land reform between 1903 and 1918. From economic concentration of assets, Mr. Chair, to political consolidation of power in 1910, when the first elections of Philippine Assembly took place, AU professor Paul Hutchcroft noted that local elites gained national prominence from where they awarded franchises. And then in the 1935 Commonwealth Constitution, this was cemented through the 60-40 rule. What started as a strange quirk caused by US domestic politics in 1902 led to a permanent fixture of increased protectionism. The only exception to this rule was granted to US citizens and corporations after World War II, which was the condition set for granting our independence. Now, although, Mr. Chair, it was considered a stain on our national sovereignty, the parity rights granted to US investors actually led to rapid growth in the 1950s, the highest rate of growth that the Philippines has experienced post-war. Through trade and monetary policies that bias the importation of capital. Sorry. That's okay. I just got a message from the Secretariat. That's okay if there's no slides. Bias the importation of capital, intermediary goods for production over consumer goods. Hutchcroft notes that manufacturing expanded by double digits during much of the decade, and the value add by industry also increased. Under President Magsaysay, the Philippines privatized many of the state-owned enterprises set up in the aftermath of the war. After Magsaysay's untimely death, the Filipino First policy gave preferential treatment to locals in using import quotas. The result was that local businesses misused these quotas to import finished goods rather than capital goods, and so the consumer bias that was spoken of earlier began. The system was gamed and corruption ensued, leading to weaker growth, triggering a foreign currency crunch which devalued the peso and led to slower growth in the 1960s compared to the 50s. This was the first boom-bust cycle, which halted our transition to a modern economy as agro exporters earned a windfall from the weaker currency, even as the industrial sector faltered. This led to social unrest and public clamor, which led to the convening of the 71 CONCON, of which my father was a member, where more restrictions on foreign direct investments were introduced. This demonstrated that we had not learned the lessons from the debacle of the first Filipino policy. I'm on slide 10, by the way, for the Secretariat's information. Also, the US parity rights enacted in 1946 lapsed by 1974, so there were no more restraints on the nationalist agenda. Slide 11, please. In the 70s, the state took the lead in industrialization through sequestration and nationalization, relying on public debt to finance it. Slide 11. Oh, are we there? Yes. Leading to relying on debt to finance this created a bubble that became unsustainable. The change in regulation led to a precipitous fall of FDI in the late 70s and contributed to the economic collapse in the 80s and tepid growth in the 90s. We missed the first wave of Japanese FDI, which flowed instead to our ASEAN neighbors. UP School of Economics Professor Noel de Dios attributes this to the perfect storm of our economic malaise, becoming the perennial sick man of Asia. Slide 12, please. Mr. Chair, contributing to this malaise, the sectors subjected to foreign restrictions were expanded further in the 87 Constitution. Next slide, please. This led Dr. Overholt of Stanford to comment that regardless of which regime was in place, the Philippines was constrained by an unholy alliance, quote unquote, of entrenched interests both from the left and the right. Next slide, please. Mr. Chair, the World Bank noted that foreign ownership is correlated with labor productivity and, might I add, higher wages. This is not only due to foreign capital, but transfer of know-how. Harvard Professor Hausman, Ricardo Hausman, who I know you're familiar with, Mr. Chair, says that unlike tangible intellectual property, which can be codified or easily acquired, tacit knowledge is stored in the brain and not easily transferred. It is easier to transfer this kind of know-how by moving the brain itself, i.e. the person, and therefore it requires greater openness on our part to foreign participation in our economy for diffusion of innovation to take place. As you can see, the share of foreign ownership of firms in our country remains small. Next slide, please. The World Bank further notes that the economic concentration in the Philippines is higher compared to our neighbors, particularly in manufacturing, despite the 100% FDI being permitted there. Does it have anything to do with the fact that our energy is a key driver of the manufacturer's costs and that the 60-40 until very recently remained in place and remains in place for transmission and distribution? Next slide, please. Mr. Chair, the Philippines is rated highly restrictive to FDI by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. If you drop down into the weeds of their scoring system, you will find that it is due to the provisions in our charter mainly, which do not appear elsewhere, as you have already alluded to, Mr. Chair. I have provided the subcommittee with a spreadsheet on which these scores were based for its information. Next slide, please. We continue to see the results of this restrictiveness in our inability to attract foreign direct investment. The Philippines is unique in our region, comprised of former colonies, Australia and New Zealand included, or occupied countries such as Japan and Korea, for having these restrictions hard-coded in our constitution. Next slide, please. As a result, we've been overtaken by our ASEAN neighbors. Next slide, please. As a result, we have been overtaken by our ASEAN neighbors. Vietnam, next slide, please, being the latest to overtake us. Next slide, please. In 1985, we had 3 times their per capita income in Vietnam, but due to their opening up through the Doi Moi reforms of '86, while we were increasing the restrictions in our 87 Constitution, Vietnam has finally overtaken us 35 years later in per capita GDP and minimum wages, may I add. Next slide, please. So, turning to RBH 6, which considers granting legislative fiat to regulate the ownership of public services, basic education, and advertising, we might ask, why is it needed, Mr. Chair? As you have, some members of the committee have asked already. Evidently, the PSA has not necessarily solved the problem. After removing electricity generation from the 60-40 rule through PSA, which is still subject to court deliberations, renewable energy is considered one of our bright spots for investment. The problem is that our electricity grid and the lack of connectivity for commercial solar and wind power projects, which are in remote places, but closer to the consumers. Distribution is still subject to 60-40. As renewable energy increases its penetration in our energy mix, the upgrade of the grid is needed to handle variable energy, or else we will risk short-circuiting and blackouts as per what happened in Panay earlier this year. Existing legislation tries to manage this, but causes slower take-up of rooftop solar due to the higher associated costs. Ari Pasco, director of the Electricity Law Initiative at Harvard Law School, talks of a utility transmission syndicate in the United States, which prevents the integration of solar and wind and battery. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has tried numerous times to expand transmission capacity to capture new clean energy sources. This decades-long effort has been nearly an impossible task, he says, transforming a system of utility monopoly fiefdoms, Mr. Chair, into competitive marketplace. As Ari put it, what the FERC is trying to do is counteract the incentives and abilities of utilities to act uncompetitively. The problem is utility control and utility interest in maintaining the status quo. Utilities, he says, for the most part, inherently aren't against clean energy, but they deploy it at the place and scale that will benefit them. So, Mr. Chair, that is one argument that I would like to put forward. I have other slides, but I will leave it at that, as I believe that I have already exceeded my time at this point. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And
Thank you very
members.
much. We appreciate the historical perspective, Dr. Santos.
Thank you.
We can hear from Mr. Ed Francisco, from the president of Video Capital. Morning, sir. Or good afternoon, rather.
Good afternoon, sir, Your Honors. Now, I just wanted to share my views. Thank you for allowing me to be here. I represent the banking industry, but in my case, I'm a practitioner. I daily speak to foreign and local investors. In fact, I'm the one talking to all the investors for the NEDA privatizations. I'm dealing for both foreign and local. Those are the long-term kinds of investors. I also deal with the short-term investors, or what, as Dr. Villegas talks about, the hot money, because the stock market, I also manage that business. So I'm doing 2 IPOs. So at least as my value add there is that I talk to the investors if they're willing to invest already. And basically, I guess I support what Dr. Villegas and Justice Carpio said. Naman, the PSA, the Foreign Investment Act, the Trade Liberalization Acts are great. And then Senator Paul asked earlier, there was really a lot of positive news from foreign investors who want to invest. They're dealing with me because they want to invest, especially in renewable energy. The big problem or the complaint they have is not naman the ownership limits. At least from a practitioner's perspective, their complaints are really more the bureaucracy, corruption, and red tape. Maybe just as an example, for the foreign investors we talk to in renewable energy, it's been reduced already, but it still takes 167 signatures for a project to get approved. So even if with the Renewable Act, with all this trade, I guess with tax benefits already, it just takes so long, and it takes around 5 years. So even if we're all in one, we want to have more energy, we want it cheaper, what's preventing the investors from actually getting their project is all the bureaucracy. So it's not naman the foreign...
Can I just, sorry, I don't usually interrupt my resource person, but that is crazy. 167 signatures. I just wanted to put that on record. Yeah, that's crazy.
Your Honor, it's actually gone down. A few years back, it was 250. So nabawasan na, but unfortunately, 167 is really I agree, sir. So that's the real bottleneck. There are many people who want to invest locally and foreign, even the large local conglomerates, but this is what they have to deal with. So I guess what I just want to say is that, yes, I also agree with the foreign chambers. Any changes to improve, I guess, investments would be appreciated, but the lower hanging fruit or the things that can really be changed, sana, is more in the bureaucracy. If your honors can do something there, that would really help and spur more investment. Thank you for that, sir.
Very much. We had a similar situation for telcos because they were complaining about the number of signatures needed to obtain or to put up a cell site tower. And in the Bayanihan 2 law, which we passed a few years back, we placed although it was time-bound, a time-bound sort of emergency provision to cut the signatures down. So I think we need to do that for just an offhand, just thinking offhand. Thank you, Mr. Francisco. Now, can we hear, thank you to our friends from the private sector. Now we have a whole slew of government agencies. We have the NEDA, USEC Rose Cedillon and USEC Crystal Uy have been waiting patiently, along with the DOF, the DTI, the BOI, the PEZA, the ICT, and the SEC. Begging your indulgence, can we hear from you, NEDA, USEC Cedillon? Thank you for waiting.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the eminent persons around this table. Thank you also for this opportunity really to discuss about this economic provisions in the Constitution. So as you know, the Philippine Development Plan 2023 to 2028 is about transformation. And I think part of the transformation is that we have to look at all those things that could facilitate that transformation. So there was a question on we have actually opened already our economy. The thing is, if you look at the OECD, they call it the restrictiveness index. So although this is still this is a 2016 document. Let me see. Sorry, 2019 document. So it talks about actually 4 aspects of this restriction. Just cannot find. Okay, 4 aspects of the restriction. The first one is to do with the foreign equity restrictions. The second one is to do with restrictions with respect to the screening, the discriminatory screening, where those coming from foreign investors are actually screened differently or are applied a stricter screening process. And then the third one has to do with they would say other aspects of restrictiveness, like with respect to let's say branching, with respect to they call it operational restrictions, like you cannot put up branches here, with respect also to ownership of land, and then the degree of transparency, and then the discretion with respect to the granting of approvals. And then the other one is with respect to restriction on foreign personnel. So with respect to this, looking at this 4, and looking at the countries Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, and Vietnam, Philippines actually comes out as the most restrictive. We will be submitting to the committee the restrictiveness with respect to certain sectors, because they looked at 22 sectors in all, and it would seem that the Philippines is most restrictive with respect to the primary sector: agriculture, fishery, forestry, mining, and quarrying, and then some secondary sectors as well, and also some tertiary sectors, which are on the services. So, and of course, you would say that there are other things that, and already mentioned by the members in this group, that there are other things that actually influence the decision to invest in another country. Now, a paper by Mitsura, also from the OECD, so this is 2019, he looked at a panel data, so looking at 55,000 actually such bilateral investments. So looking at inward FDI stocks and controlling for the aspects of, let's say, distance, let's say, the capacity of the economy, looking at the GDP, looking also at the difference in the GDP, looking also at similarity in terms of language, and also if the country has been a colony before, and looking at so many. So in other words, controlling for the other factors. So so the result is that the restrictiveness index actually is still comes out as a barrier. It's a barrier to. I'm looking at my notes. As a barrier to investment with respect to total foreign investments, and then and then if you look at the restriction on foreign equity, it's a barrier to the total foreign investments. If you look at the other restrictions, it's a barrier to the mergers and acquisition in type of investments, and also the investments in services. So clearly there is a link between restrictiveness and the FDI, the sort of FDI flows that we receive. Now, there's also a question about the link between FDI and economic growth. Again, the direction of causality, is not really as definite as that. There are, of course, many other aspects that you need to consider. But there is a later paper also saying that it really depends on the capacity of the country to absorb that FDI and the kind of FDI that it is actually attracting. So as you know, there are many objectives of FDI. So one is that it's market seeking. So if you have a big market like China, for instance, then again, it's a magnet for FDI. Second is that it's a resource seeking. So if you already have, the resources in place, like mining, like the minerals, then again, it's a magnet for the FDI. And the third one is the kind of FDI that we want, which is efficiency seeking, because we're not really a big market. Minerals, we're kind of still iffy on that. But the efficiency seeking is really the kind of FDI that we want. But this one really means that we have a very productive workforce, very competitive workforce at that. And what is being cited as a determinant of this is really the quality of the education. And this is again another aspect in the Constitution with respect to restrictiveness that we would like to have more discussions about, because we think that this is something that should really be addressed. We looked at other jurisdictions with respect to education, and we see that many of our neighbors actually have lifted the foreign equity restrictions. Malaysia allows 100%, Vietnam allows 100%, Thailand 50%, Indonesia 49%, Singapore 100%, Philippines 40%. And we also look
What
at
specifically ho yun, Yusek Rose, just for the record?
sorry,
Ano po yung in what investment in what?
yeah, foreign ownership of educational institutions. So in higher education ito.
Thank you.
Actually for Bangkok it's open kahit ano, even basic. So in the case of Singapore and also Malaysia later on, there was that conscious that was a deliberate effort in their case to really build a knowledge economy, to be an education hub for Asia. And so actually there was even a time that they were very active in poaching all the good professors, whether in the Philippines or in other countries, because they really wanted to build that knowledge economy. And actually they succeeded, because there have been many campuses of international schools that have that were set up in the Philippines. Now, in Singapore. Now, you might say that we already passed the Transnational Higher Education Act, which already allows for exchange programs, etc. But the problem is that it did not touch on the 60-40 in terms of the ownership of the foreign schools. And then I also looked at the review by the British Council of the higher education institutions in the Philippines, and they listed actually 10 various provisions that they have to face if you are a foreign school. And the constitutional provision is just one of them. The other is the Corporation Code. You have also the capitalization. You have the National Internal Revenue Code, etc. So 10 of this. So there are, as mentioned in the OECD, when you talk about restrictiveness, it's not just to do with the Constitution, although that's a big part, but there has to be a follow-through with respect to the other aspects. And so if you are also with respect to investments or production processes, we have what we call a smile curve, where let's say if you draw on the vertical axis the value added, and then on the horizontal axis is the production process, from design to the prototyping part up to then the assembly, and then let's say the after sales service, the advertising, etc., etc. So you have that smile curve, meaning that the higher value added is really on the design part, and then also on the after sales, the advertising part. And then here in the middle is the assembly, but that is also where you have the lowest value added. And unfortunately, that's the kind of the FDI that we have. So we are into, we get the raw materials, let's say for our manufacturing, and then just do some additional, and then export it. So, and the thing is, we cannot do the design part, and it's really because we have a very low, in terms of the human capital for the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So again, it has to do with, the lack of good higher education institutions. And then, already mentioned was the challenge before the Supreme Court of the Philippine, the Public Service Act. And so we hope that this could be addressed as well. And we do hope that, as mentioned by Attorney Villegas earlier, that we would have the tools, and also the next generation would have the tools necessary to really adjust to a VUCA world. And just for the record, I just want to say as well that the issue of national security is in the PDP, so it's in Chapter 13. Sayang wala na si Professor Carlos. Anyway, I also want to mention. I also want to.
Sayang, wala na siya.
Wala na siya. Okay, basta on the record, nandiyan siya. Okay. Hindi niya na-google na maayos. Anyway, I also want to mention that with respect to the MSMEs, and this is what we actually addressed in the amendments to the RTLA, the Retail Trade Liberalization Law, that in the Philippines, as you know, the MSMEs is about 99.6% of all enterprises. The micros are actually 90.5%. The small comprise 8.7%, and the medium comprise 0.4%. And we think that this the medium type of enterprises are really necessary for there to be, good competition. They're the ones that can really, present, that can scale up and present that challenge to the large ones, so that they don't have that dominant power. At the same time, that they can actually have more of the backward linkage coming from the micro and the small. When COVID we had COVID, and what happened was the total number of enterprises, to be fair, actually went up from what it was in 2019 all the way to 2022. But it was actually the micro enterprises that increased. The small enterprises declined by 11%, and then the medium scale enterprises declined by 9%. And that is why in the amended RTLA, we made sure that the threshold actually does not include the medium, so that we can allow foreign investments into the medium scale enterprises, because this is what we think will, is something that could lend dynamism to our enterprises. I think that is I'll stop there so that the other members of the executive can also discuss. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair.
A lot of good points there. I'd just like to, sorry, with your indulgence, Senator Risa, we'll ask for more information on the SMILE curve and on the what your point about the medium, just to clarify, just some clarifications. I'll have my staff do it to you, not to take up the time of the subcommittee. Senator Risa.
Salamat, Chair. Just one quick follow-up question at this point. Dahil binanggit po ni Yusek Rosemary yung Philippine Development Plan. Tama po ba na sa Philippine Development Plan 2023 to 2028, wala namang pagbanggit na kailangang amyendahan yung konstitusyon?
Tama po na wala. And that's really because, we have to, kumbaga yun yung constraint namin. It's an initial condition.
It's an initial condition?
Initial condition.
But in any case, for me, it was just a question of fact. So salamat dun sa confirmation na nung binubuo ng NEDA, ng National Economic Development Authority, ang Philippine Development Plan, binubuo ng buong administrasyon kasi ang chair ng NEDA ay si Presidente mismo, to bring our country from where we are now, economically development-wise, to yung vision nila by 2028, 6 years, na makamit yung development targets natin, makamit yung pati yung sustainable development goals, sa dinami-dami ng kinonsider dyan na pangangailangan, problema at potensyal at mga targets talaga, hindi talaga nakita na kakailanganin yung charter change. So I just like to make that of record, Mr.
Can I see a raising of hands? Who among you, based on your agency's position, who among you are in favor of amending the restrictive provisions of our economic provisions of our Constitution? Can I see a raising of hands? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
No one on the private side, just the government side.
Government side, 6.
Are you asking also just to clarify, Sen. Bato? Kasama ba yung, are they also?
Ito, 10.
They're also part of the survey. Yeah, you're part of the survey, so you have the option to abstain if you wish.
Yeah. Gusto ko lang malaman.
Okay, yes, can we ask for the raising of hands again, sir? Yeah, please.
1, 2,
Mr. Chairman.
3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So 8.
Mr. Chairman, I abstain. I think for a foreigner, this would be a very difficult thing to do. Thank you.
I understand. You've made your position clear, Mr. Payne. Thank you.
Thank you. So 8, 2.
I wish the government could really push on that connection, because that's leaving a lot of power, what's the word, stranded or not available to those who need it. Yeah. Senator Risa? Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, I also appreciate the inputs of Dr. Ocampo. And not just sad, pero provocative, like this ASEAN grid. Malay ba natin kaya nating humabol dyan? And again, not solely through the Cha-Cha route. For example, if I'm just thinking aloud here, if we were to amend existing laws, including the EPIRA, and acting together, they could create those connections that are needed. So just something to think about as we move forward, conducting these hearings, of course, also in aid of legislation. So maraming salamat para dyan, sir. Sige, on the Public Service Act naman, if Yusek Rosemary will bear with me, I'd like to pose these questions to NEDA as well. So under the Public Service Act, NEDA can recommend the classification of a public service as a critical infrastructure. So ano-ano po yung mga public services na ngayon kino-consider na critical infrastructures?
Yeah, Madam Chair. Right now, we're just looking at it's the telecoms industry that is still identified in the law and in the IRR. We are actually requesting for a TA on this because we are supposed to come up also with a baseline survey, and so we are requesting for a TA from World Bank on which to base actually yung define ng ano yung gagawin ng public utilities. Thank you.
So sa ngayon, prior the baseline survey, meron na ba kayong inirekomenda, I mean ang NEDA, na iba pang public services for classification as critical infrastructures?
None yet, Madam Chair. Mr. Chair, thank you.
Alright. Salamat, ma'am. I'm asking this also because kasama po ni dating Senator at ngayon Secretary Ralph Recto at ni dating Senador Kiko Pangilinan. Actually, kumontra po ako sa Public Service Act amendments dahil sa tingin ko yung telecommunications, airports, at mga tren at riles dapat manatiling public utilities na hindi mapapasa ilalim sa kontrol ng dayuhan. Pero sa huli, so ipinasa ang RA 11659 para palawakin ang public services na pwedeng pasukin ng dayuhan. Pero pagkatapos ng maraming debate, nilinaw ng batas yung kakaibang pagtrato sa critical infrastructure na sa tingin ko po nararapat lang. So dito, bawal magmay-ari ang anumang entity na kontrolado o kumikilos para sa dayuhang gobyerno o foreign state-owned enterprise. And I remember that our good chair himself, Sen. Sonny, even interpellated the sponsor on this specific point. And if I remember correctly, and please correct me if I'm wrong, his concern then was on the law effectively allowing China to own and take control of Dito Telecom. But according to our good chair of that bill, now law, may additional safeguards sa telecoms industry dahil tinuturing nga itong critical infrastructure. So that. Ngayon, ang legislatura, so parehong sa Senado at saka sa House of Representatives, kinilala yung pangangailangang protektahan ang critical infrastructure. So sa RBH 6, sa tingin ng NEDA, tama po ba na wala nang ganitong distinction, wala nang ganitong proteksyon sa critical infrastructure?
Actually, no. National security is really an issue that we should really take very seriously. And so, kaya nandun pa rin talaga yung mga, kumbaga yung protection na yun, really looking at the security review. So that's part of it. Meron na actually guidelines para doon. All those other safeguards with respect to information, kukuha sila ng yung parang ISO na certification and all that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
At ngayong lumalalim yung hidwaan sa pagitan ng mga bansa, mas nagiging konkreto yung mga banta sa cybersecurity natin. Di ba, mas mahalaga pa nga na protektahan yung national security natin?
Yes, of course. But like I said, actually yung issue of cybersecurity, nandyan talaga siya, no? Regardless of course, like you said, with the geopolitical tension, mas prominent siya. But just the same, we really need to beef up our capacity to guard against cyber attacks.
Salamat, Yusek. So I think one thing that's affirmed to me dito sa recent exchange natin, kailangan explicit, even for those who support RBH 6, na merong pa ring pagkakaiba yung mga ituturing na critical infrastructure. Hindi sila kapareho lang ng iba na pwede lang buksan sa 100% foreign ownership dahil nga critical infrastructure sila. So isang halimbawa lang before I leave this topic. Napabalita na mayroon ng 3 prospective winning bidders yung 170.6 billion peso na IA privatization. Sa pagkakaalam ko, all of the 3 bidders have foreign partners based on existing cap on foreign equity ownership. Pero sa amended Public Service Act natin ay iniwan sa diskresyon ng Pangulo ng Pilipinas kung alin sa natitira pang public services ang itatalaga nito na critical infrastructure. So sa RBH 6 po ba, nakikita nyo ba na may plano na nating itodo bukas sa foreign ownership ang lahat at alisin na ang naiwang diskresyon sa Pangulo sa bagay na ito?
I think the issue of security, national security for that matter, is, it's really parang overarching consideration naman to. Parang regardless of whether we go by the RBH 6 or not, nandiyan lagi yung consideration for national security.
So again, dapat explicit na mayroong pa ring discretion ang presidente to determine which are critical infrastructures and therefore not subject to total opening to foreign ownership.
I think, Madam Chair, if the language of the law is yung ilalagay lang yung unless otherwise provided for by law, and our current legal framework is the amended Foreign Investment Act and then the Amendment Public Service Act, nakalagay naman yun doon. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Binabalikan ko lang po itong issue, Mr. Chair, kasi maalala natin nung nagkaroon ng shutdown sa airport nung nakaraang New Year at saka Labor Day, sinabi ko na hindi silver bullet yung solution na privatization dahil ang nakita kong mas problema dito ay kapabayaan, hindi lack of funds o opportunities para sa modernization. NAIA actually generates an annual operating income of at least 15 billion pesos. This was pre-pandemic, of course, 2019. At nakakabawi rin ito ngayon. Unfortunately, very little is left with MIAA for operations, as 50% or more of its net income is remitted to the national treasury, on top of the 20% national government share in the authority's operating income based on actual collections. Kaya hirap ang MIAA sa sariling upgrading at modernization. And according to the Workers' Union, Mr. Chair, the Samahan ng mga Manggagawa sa Paliparan ng Pilipinas or SMPP, 5 to 7% na lang ang budget para sa maintenance every year. Hindi parang kahawig-halos ito ng Transco na kumikita naman ng 20 billion pesos kada taon pero ipinamigay natin sa lokal at dayuhang konsorsyum ng NGCP para patakbuhin at pagkitaan. So sana does NEDA have any thought about that? What we did to Transco in this whole privatization process?
Baka si Yusek. No, just to say that in the amended Foreign Investment Public Service Act, there actually is a provision for yung performance requirement, monitoring by the regulator. So merong mga performance parameters, and parang on this basis merong I believe may sanction na nandun. I just forgot kung ano yung nilagay doon na sanction. Pero kasama yun sa safeguard. With respect to Transco, I'm not privy to that info unless Yusek Agabi.
Would Yusek Agabin care to comment on this, Mr. Chair?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the question, Chair.
I was wondering about how Transco was handled. Speaking of performance requirements, kung in terms of its financial performance, it was profiting 20 billion pesos every year, but we turned it over to the NGCP consortium. And in terms of performance requirements, I don't know how well the NGCP is acting as a system operator.
So I think there are some sectors, or there's some people who believe, based on hindsight, that maybe the national grid should not have been privatized. But then there's also views which says that privatization actually worked because they were able to put in the needed capital to improve the grid itself. So it's mixed, Madam Chair.
Fair enough, Mr. Chair.
Your permission,
record.
Senator.
Yes, Mr. Chair.
We're still paying the debts from Naku. Bayad na ba yun? Yung from the time of Naku, when the whole power sector was in public hands.
If you look
we incurred massive debts, di ba?
Yes, sir.
And when have we paid those debts already?
We are still paying for some.
We're still paying those debts, correct?
If you look at your bill, you will see the universal charges. UCSD is universal charge stranded debt, and SCC stranded contract costs.
those are the amounts we're still paying for, Mr. Chair.
A reminder kasi we often hear, not from Senator Risa, but from other sectors, na dapat gobyerno nag-handle niyan eh. Dati nga gobyerno nag-handle, tingnan nyo nangyari. Go ahead, Sen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And fair enough, Yusek, it is a mixed record of privatization. Pero I'm glad na may openness of mind tayo na sometimes privatization is not the best mode, sector by sector or industry by industry sa ating ekonomiya. Kaya exciting din tignan kung paano mangyayari yung review at saka amendment or updating ng IPIRA. Yung huling tanong ko, Mr. Chair, tamang-tama, Yusek Agabin is on board. It's for the DOF. Ito naman, itatanong ko sana kay Sec Ralph. Pero just in case you've had a conversation on this subject with him, mula nung deliberations sa Public Service Act, yung concerns nyo ba, concerns ni Sec Ralph on the protection of critical infrastructure, nagbago ba ito? Kasi naalala ko rin, my colleagues will correct me if I'm wrong, nung deliberation sa PSA bill, may sinasabi si Sec Ralph noon, Sen noon, masyadong loose yung definition ng public utilities to the point na kontra sa at least sense at spirit ng deliberations ng CONCOM of 1986. Naalala ko, napansin ni Sec Ralph noon, Sen Ralph, na yung sa bill, yung seaport, critical infra, pero airport, hindi. So would the good USEC have knowledge kung mula no nagbago yung concerns ni Sec Ralph dun sa usaping yan?
Interestingly, Mr. Chair, Madam Senator, when we were discussing it, Sec Ralph did mention that he voted against it. Those were his same concerns, and he actually said that, I'm actually open to it when it comes to toll roads. So, and he didn't say that his view has changed. He did mention his perspective when you were crafting the amendment to the PSA, Madam Chair.
Maraming salamat. It's, I think, for us legislators as interesting to look at or be reminded of the deliberations on bills as it is for us all now to be reminded of the deliberations on the Constitution. So maraming salamat, Yusek Agabi. Maraming salamat, Mr. Chair. Those are my questions.
Thank you very much, Senator Risa. Senator Bato, anything else before we... thank you. Any last word from the resource persons? I'm sure we're all somewhat exhausted from a very stimulating discussion, and allow me to thank our resource persons, especially those who stayed. Risa, thank you for waiting patiently. You have 10 minutes then, Senator Bato, afterwards, if you wish. Yeah. Go ahead, ma'am.
Salamat, Mr. Chair.
So I think some of our resource persons took the health break as a permanent break.
Speaking of which,
Go
actually,
ahead, Senator Risa. So we still have very good resource persons here in the person of our economic agencies. Go ahead, ma'am.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. Actually, yung una kong tanong sana kay Justice Carpio, but maybe for the next hearing if he will be with us.
If you can send him your questions, ma'am, or if you wish. Yeah.
Salamat, Chair. Siguro, on the legitimacy of the need for RBH 6, I was going to ask this to Sec Balisacan, but after hearing the presentation of Dr. Angeles, sir, if I could ask this question of you. In 2019, a deputy ombudsman said that, estimated that we lose 700 billion pesos or 20% of government's budget to what are stolen from the coffers of government of the country due to corruption. And based on the Corruption Perceptions Index, we're still in the top third, the Philippines, of the most corrupt countries in the world. And in many other studies on corruption, that corruption is still a big deterrent on foreign direct investment. So hindi kaya mas importanteng pagtuunan ito ng pansin, combating corruption, even more than amending the Constitution?
Thank you for the question, ma'am. I perhaps one can take note of the studies that Yusek Edilion and I think also Professor Fabella and their colleagues drafted. I suppose one way of thinking of it is we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can address both at the same time. And I believe the studies also show that removing these restrictions, ceteris paribus, is also beneficial. Certainly addressing the corruption, red tape, and so on are also going to be beneficial.
Thank you, Dr. Angeles. Salamat po. Mr. Chair, moving on to, if I may, although it's not the specific subject of RBH 6, not one of the, pero I think there are lessons we can learn from just a few questions about energy generation and distribution. Okay. So since Yusek Rosemary is here with us, ma'am. If you could field these questions or refer to one of your colleagues from NEDA for these. In the energy transmission and distribution sector for electricity, 40% is owned by the State Grid Corporation of China. And our Senate Committee on Energy learned that they have a veto power because of this 40% ownership in the NGCP. Same goes for Meralco, 43% is owned by foreign interests. So, and we know that Meralco and NGCP are not lacking for profits, and these profits can be invested so that we don't anymore suffer the blackouts also mentioned by our resource persons recently on Panay Island, on Guimaras Island as well, before that on Mindoro Island. And so that we can modernize our grid and make it even more ready and capable for the entry of renewable energy supplies in the coming years. So mas bibilis po ba yung pagbagsak ng presyo ng kuryente? Mas maaasahan ba natin yung pagkakaroon ng no blackout, renewable energy ready na grid at saka distribution system? At mas titibay din ba tayo laban sa mga cyber threats kung mas maraming dayuhan ang magpapasok ng kapital o kung yung China State Grid Corporation mismo at yung Salim Group ang magiging controlling shareholder sa dalawang kumpanyang iyon, NGCP at saka Meralco?
Yeah, Madam Chair, I'm not an engineer, so
Na nung binubuo ng NEDA, ng National Economic Development Authority, ang Philippine Development Plan, binubuo ng buong administrasyon kasi ang chair ng NEDA ay si Presidente mismo, to bring our country from where we are now, economically, development-wise, to yung vision nila by 2028, 6 years na makamit yung development targets natin, makamit yung pati yung sustainable development goals. Sa dinami-dami ng kinonsider dyan na pangangailangan, problema at potential at mga targets talaga, hindi talaga nakita na kakailanganin yung charter change. So I just like to make that.
Huwag na po tayong Filipino first. No one study I have seen thus far has demonstrated quite creditably that ownership by Filipinos work. I challenge anyone here around the table, social scientists. Economic managers cannot in fact lower or eradicate the 21% of their big levels na sinabi mo, no? Na mga poor. Aba, mag-hire tayo po ng international group of economic managers. We pay them depending on the percentage of increment that they are going to contribute to GDP. I know this is an iconoclastic viewpoint, but for God's sake, we have to be iconoclast now. You know, we are the fifth most mineralized countries in the world. We have millions of professionals. We should be embarrassed that we have 21% who are poor. Tama ba, Dr. Villegas? Tama, di ba? Asked me to help them design their strategy for the Air Force, for the Philippine Marines, etc. Sabi ko, saan ba kayo nakatukod yung strategy nyo? Meron bang National Defense Plan? O bungang isip nyo lang yan? Saan magagaling yung National Defense Plan, Senator Po? Hindi. Senator Po, you mentioned something about banning certain countries from ownership. And are you referring to China?
In the Public Service Act, any country that the President or the National Security Council views as